friends. Hello. Like I said, my name's Kay, and it is so good to be with you. I'm looking forward to diving in this morning to have some conversation about race and racism and racial equity in the United States. And we'll kind of our time together is I want it to feel like a time that's really yours and where you can ask some things and say some things and we can talk about some things. But I want to start by knowing who you all are. I'd love to begin there. Um, so, oh, I'm getting messages about loving the GIFs already, and you have no idea how much that makes my heart soar. But I'd love for you to start by just chatting in. I want to know who you all are. There's over 100 of us. I'd love for you to chat in who you are and where you are. So tell me your name and tell me where you're calling in from, just so I can know who's with us this morning. So I'm Kay. I'm calling in from Herndon, Virginia, which is right by Dulles Airport and at the end of the Silver Line. So not super far. Becky, director of Rock in Rockville, Maryland. I love it. Abby from Silver Spring. Hello. Tanya from Waldorf. Hello. They're coming in. Who are you and where are you? Callie from Falston. Savannah, also Falston. Ava, outside Baltimore. Chris Towson. Oh, they're coming in. Will from Westminster. Denise from Temple Hills. Blair Lee from California, Maryland. Not just California, Maryland. Well, friends, it is fun for me. I know you can't see all these messages, but it's fun for me to see where you are calling in from. Amelia from Catonsville. Abby just asked if there's going to be a Q&A at the end, and there absolutely will be. And in fact, there is going to be a Q&A right in the middle, because I really want this to be a space that's led by you all, so that where you feel like you can ask the things and get out of this what you want to be. So I have some questions in here that I find myself asking a lot, in case y'all don't jump in with questions, but there's going to be plenty of time for you to ask questions. But I'd like to start with just some frame for us. I work for an organization called the People's Supper, and we gather people for dialogue across difference all the time. And we use the language of brave space to frame those gatherings. When we're asking people to get vulnerable and to share their stories and to dive into topics that can feel complicated, we use the language of brave space for a couple of reasons. And I'd love for this to be kind of language that we sit with as well in this time. And we use brave space because this conversation might require us to get a little bit uncomfortable, and that's okay. And actually, it's pretty important. Our examining our own questions and our own stories and our own communities might require us to just be a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. And it takes some courage. It takes some courage to show up. I would say that the conversation about racial equity is one of the most important conversations of our time. And it takes some real courage to show up in that conversation. And so we are going to kind of rest on the language of brave space in our time together. And a couple of other ways I'd love for us to think about this space is, this is my edited GIF. You see, I added a little we. But I'd love for us to remember and be mindful over our time together that we are all co-learners, that all of us have things to learn about race, about racism in the United States, and that all of us can come together as a community of people who are wanting to learn alongside one another. And next to that is, if somebody shares something of their story, if somebody is kind of really vulnerable here, which there is room for that, we're going to ask that we hold that as sacred, that we kind of keep each other's stories, experiences, and sharing confidential as applicable. And you'll know what to and not to share from this space. But if we could use this as a space for us to just be holding one another well, I think that will be really important. So now open your chat boxes back up again. And if you don't know where they are, it's at the bottom of your screen, the little speech bubble. And I'd love for you to tell me, why are you here? What is it that brings you to this particular session? I think that this is a topic everyone needs to learn about, including me. Absolutely. Folks who are helping with youth ministry, and this might come up. We need to be able to support a diverse youth group. There's a lot in the news, and it's hard to know what to do when we live in areas that might not be as diverse. Racism is hard to talk about, but we need to talk about it. It's difficult to do, but it's better to do sooner than later. Yeah, thank you for these answers, friends. For me, I think some of what comes up in my own thinking about what brings me here is so much of what you all said. We've been hearing about racism in the news. I think racism is kind of woven through the fabric of our own country and our own history. And it's important for us to sit and think about that. And to me, that so much comes from who I know Jesus to be. Jesus is a God who constantly challenged the people in his time to make real changes towards justice. And that Jesus really cared about justice and about people. And so showing up towards the conversation about race and racial equity is incredibly important. A bit of Black history. How many United States presidents owned enslaved people? 23, 5, 9, or 12? Pick red for 23, blue for 5, yellow for 9.
I'd say 5.
12. I hear some 5s, I hear some 9s, I see a 23 in the chat. All right, let's see.
12.
Correct answer is 12. 53
Oh.
of you got that right.
12.
Here we go. You get points for how quickly you jump in. So these are our top 5 people right now. Next question. What year did Disney come out with the first Black princess? 1974, 2009, 1991, or 2015?
2015.
Yeah.
Here, 2015. I see a 2009 in the chat. Answers are still coming in. I see a 2015 guess. A couple of those.
Hold up. What do y'all want to say? 2009.
I see someone said 2009. Abby, you're right on who the princess was, but not right on the year in the chat. So 72 of y'all got that right. Let's see where we stand. Ooh. All right, here's our top 5. Next question. When did interracial marriage become legal in the United States? 1963, 1980, 1890, I apologize, 1945, or 1920? I see some of those guesses in the chat. Got 4 seconds left to answer if you haven't already. 1963, that's right. 92 of y'all got that right. Amelia swings into the lead. All right, next. When did Pixar have their first Black lead character? 1985, 1994, 2020, or 2003? See someone 2020 in the chat. Another 2020 in the chat. That's right, 2020. Pixar Soul was the first Black lead character in a Pixar movie. And then one final trivia question for us. Julie, whoa, Amelia, what happened? Amelia got knocked out of the leaderboard from first. All right. When did the Black Lives Matter movement start? 2018, 2020, or 2020, 2013, or 2015? I see a 2015 in the chat, a 2013 in the chat, a 2020 in the chat, and a 2018 in the chat. All these answers have been guessed in the chat. You got 5 seconds to add in your answer now. 2013. This one looks like the toughest one, but I see some clapping in the group from some folks. I'm assuming got it right. Let's see where our final leaders stand. Abby, first place. R, some sort of gibberish is our third place winner. Dog, my dog is right here, is fourth place, and Gabe came in fifth. Now, our last question is not really we'll just do it. It's a true or false. At least one of these answers surprised me. Blue for true, red for false. True. True in the chat.
True.
Perfect. You got 10 seconds to throw in your answers, friends.
We'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, we're going to say in the chat.
We'll put it in the chat.
91 of you said true. And I have the same reaction. It was true for me too. My partner told me this morning that I couldn't make it have a right or wrong answer if it's a question about your own experience. But it is true. It was true for me. It was true for me that the more I learn about race and the history of racism in the United States, the more I find myself surprised. And I think it's important for us to come into conversations like this with a willingness to learn a little bit of our history, and also to be able to be open to all that we might not know. So a little bit of my story, and then I think we might jump ahead. I'm Kay, like I said, and this is my best friend in the whole world, Chelsea. And Chelsea would lose her mind if she knew I showed you these photos. But a fun little fact about Chelsea is that today is Chelsea's birthday, so I feel particularly sentimental about our friendship. But Chelsea has been my friend since we were little kids, and Chelsea is the first place. Chelsea's friendship is the context by which I first realized that I was a white person. When we were about 6 years old, thank you. Happy birthday, Chelsea. When we were about 6 years old, we were at a Girl Scout event, and someone said to us, "You two are like the black and white versions of one another." And I remember watching that hit her differently than it hit me, but I remember not quite being able to figure out why. And my parents explained, like, "Oh, that's because you're each a different race." And they kind of gave me an explanation, but that's about all they said. And I grew up kind of boasting about how Chelsea was a person who I knew everything about, everything. You know how it is with your best friend. You know all the things about them. They know all the things about you. And it wasn't until Chelsea and I got to college, which was right, and we were graduating from college as the Black Lives Matter movement was really kind of starting and forming in the United States in 2013. And I remember being confused and not fully knowing. I was hearing the things Black Lives Matter was saying and not fully understanding it and not quite being able to grasp or see. And I remember that some of my friends' reactions were to say things like, "All lives matter," "Blue lives matter." And I remember that in my uncomfortability, I was quiet. I didn't take a stance. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. And it hit me once that I had never asked Chelsea what she thought about it all. And I had never asked Chelsea about her experience as a Black woman in the United States. And so one day I called her and had her come over. We were graduated from college. And I said, "Chelsea, do you mind if I just ask you about this?" And what followed was a series of an hour or two of conversation where she retold me the story of our growing up together, with stories of her experiencing racism, of her fear about her brother being pulled over by the police, of so many moments that I had never seen in her. And it was this surprise for me of both that I could know so little about my best friend's experience, and second, that we could have grown up together and we could have been in the exact same space and these things were happening to her that I wasn't able to see. And so Chelsea is a person who continues to help me learn and to see and to grow, and who helps me understand what it means to live towards justice in our country. And so before I open it up for questions, I'm noticing our time. We'll jump through some of these numbers, but let's just define a couple of things and then let our conversation be question led, if you will. So it helps us to start with some shared definitions here. Race is a social construct that divides people into different groups based on their skin color. So race is kind of is the way that we look at people and divide us accordingly to our skin color. And then racism is the marginalization, which we'll talk about in a second, or oppression of people of color based on race, that a racial hierarchy, so the idea that some races are better than others, that privileges white people. Something that's important about this is you might have heard people say before that that white people can experience racism too, but that's actually not exactly how this works. Racism is when we have a the idea of a racial hierarchy, that white people are superior in some way to the other races. That gives white people power in a way that means that they can't experience racism, because racism is what oppresses people of color. A couple other helpful terms for us before we kind of jump into some things that you want to know about are equality versus equity. So equality is kind of like this image, I think, is a helpful way to think about some of it. Equality is the image on the left where you just give everybody the same thing, right? And it's equal. But on the right, we're looking at a picture of equity, which is to say that if our goal is to make sure everyone can see the baseball game, we want to give people the tools that gives them access and opportunity. And it's not sufficient to just give everyone the same thing without taking into context who they are, what their experience has been. And so to me, equity is when we want to work towards racial equity in our country. And what that means is that you can't look at someone and see that their race is a predictor for life outcomes. So what I mean by that is right now in our country, 1 in 3 Black boys born in the United States is predicted to spend some sort of time in prison, even though and the number for white boys born in the United States is 1 in 24. And that's a pretty significant difference. And the research shows us that white people and Black people are committing crimes in our country at about the same rate. So that helps us see that there's a equity issue, that there's a race issue in our country, that we have systems in our country that are disproportionately harming Black people. Another way to think about this is that when our country has equity, the population percentage will align. So Black people make up about 33% of people in prison in the United States, but only about 12% of our population. And so again, we're seeing that that's a disparity, that there's not equity in that case. So those are just some helpful kind of definitions that keep us kind of on the same page. They might be a little bit confusing, but I think they'll make some sense if we keep chatting about it. But I would love to start here as kind of our discussion. And I have some questions I can throw at you that we can use. But instead, I'd love to start with, in the chat, what's a question related to race that you don't understand, that you might like to understand, but you don't always feel comfortable bringing up or not knowing about? If you want to chat in some questions that you have about race. And I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can see you all, and know that your chats are going just to us, just to the leaders, so that your questions will remain anonymous. But what's a question that you have about race in the United States, or something you've seen and you've learned or that you don't quite understand? So somebody asked, I mentioned the language of Blue Lives Matter. And so somebody asked earlier on, what is Blue Lives Matter? And in the Black Lives Matter movement was created out of the moment that a boy named Trayvon Martin was killed by a police officer in Florida. And so when that kind of Black Lives Matter became this rallying cry, social movement in response, and then I'm imagining some of you learned about Black Lives Matter over the last year after George Floyd was killed by a group of police officers. And Blue Lives Matter was a response some people gave saying that was talking about police. So blue lives being police lives. And I would say that a way I might engage in a conversation with someone who says blue lives matter is that's not really the same thing. When we're talking about Black Lives Matter, we're talking about someone's identity and their race. We're talking about blue lives matter, we're talking about someone's profession. And so the parallel is really doesn't really work. And there are Black police officers. And so we're talking about something that really doesn't have a parallel. And so oftentimes something I'll do is when I hear people kind of respond with defensiveness or get kind of a little bit of a fight in them in response to something like Black Lives Matter, I'll try to get behind that, try to understand what is it about the language of Black Lives Matter that hits them so hard. So Callie asked a good question, or I'm sorry, we'll get to Callie's question, but another question is, how do I deal with it when someone says, well, all lives matter, when I hear them say that Black Lives Matter? It's a great question. I think for me, a couple of things come to mind in response to that question. One is that I absolutely believe that all lives matter fundamentally, and I think all of us do. The reality is that, just kind of like we started to touch on in this in a moment ago, excuse me, is that right now we have a country where Black people are disproportionately harmed and marginalized by police, by our systems of prison, by other kind of like racism exists in our country and disproportionately affects and harms Black people. And so in order for all lives to matter, we have to care about Black lives mattering. Yeah, this is helpful. These are good questions. Callie asked, is social media a good way of talking out the Black Lives Matter movement when not everyone agrees with it? It's interesting. I think social media can be such a powerful tool, and social media can be a place where so much is lost. So you can really lose people's voice inflection, their tone, their body language, and those are such key parts of how we communicate. It can be really hard to kind of level with someone or see. It's not only that they can't see your reaction, it's that so often if I'm having a conversation about race with someone, I can track like, oh, I saw that made you kind of wince a little bit, and I wonder what that was. And I think that's a really important piece. So I think that for me, I try not to use social media as a place where I'm having conversation about Black Lives Matter. And sometimes I will, but usually if I do that, I try to take it into like a private setting. So I'll use Facebook Messenger or a direct message on Instagram. And just normally what I'll do is some of the ways that I often address if I see somebody say something that's done harm. What I'll do is kind of, let me share my screen with you. This is kind of how I think about response. So how do I talk to my friends and family about race and racism in the United States? A couple of things I think are helpful to know that show up in kind of social media or otherwise is first, knowing what your entry point is and why you want to talk to somebody about it helps you know then how to start. So am I wanting to talk to my friends or family member because I have some questions and I want to learn? That's a totally different setup for a conversation than am I wanting to talk to a friend or family member because I'm concerned about some of the perspectives they hold or some of the things that they've been saying. I think this work requires our own learning and accompanying other people in their learning too. And so your conversations about this might come from all different places. But I would say that you can bring it up directly. And this again might be in response to a social media post. And so I would start with some disarming honesty, if you will. I think kind of being really upfront and direct is helpful. Hey, I noticed you posted this thing on Instagram yesterday that has kind of been sitting with me. and I wanted to have a conversation with you about it. Or, hey, mom and dad, I really want to learn about a little bit more about race in the United States. I saw this thing on the news and I wondered if we could talk about it. The other thing you can do is, if you're wanting to just be part of this conversation more and more, is to pay attention to where race is already part of your daily life and use those spaces as a conversation starter. So, for example, for me, one of the things that I do for part of my job is I plan weddings. And yesterday, somebody asked if I'd be comfortable planning a wedding at a venue that used to be a plantation that had enslaved people on it. And so that was a moment where in my normal life, I was confronted with a question about race and racial equity, and I had to respond to it. And that was then something that I could come home for dinner and share with my partner of like, hey, this was something that came up today that I've been thinking a lot about that I want to share with you. If somebody says something that's hurtful or racist, I think your responses are to do this, right? So some of our maybe responding to people on social media is that thing they posted was really hurtful or harmful. Your first is to just start with some humility and take a deep breath, is to be able to acknowledge that we're all learning and to begin by giving someone a chance to correct before you fight them on something. Then I would say you name what came up for you. So for me, what that looks like is saying something like, let me think. My partner's name is Jake, so I'll use him as an example. I might say, hey, Jake, that thing you said just kind of hit me funny. When you said it, I noticed that my body, like I tensed up a little bit and it made me want to react. And the reason for that is I think the thing you said was a little bit had some bias in it, or maybe was a misunderstanding of the issue of racism in the United States. And so naming kind of what came up for you and why, like I said, I think it's helpful to say, I noticed that I reacted. I noticed that when you said that, it landed on me funny. And then I would invite them back in. And so what I would say is, if I'm addressing something that my partner said or my friend said or my family member said, I would start by naming what came up. And then I would say, maybe a different way you might think about it is this, right? So you give people then some sort of invitation to their own continued learning instead of using it as an opportunity to just call them out and make them and push them aside. Is race only a black and white issue? It is not only a black and white issue at all. And it's an easy kind of place for us to start because that's a pretty prevalent distinction, especially in the United States, with the history of enslavement and of the Jim Crow laws and so on in our history. There is a really particular and different experience of Black folks in the United States. And so when we start talking about racism, it's an easy place to start, but it is by no means the only experience of racism in the United States. I wonder if I'm seeing a lot of other questions, and I can follow up to you all with answering your questions beyond this space, because I'm noticing we have a couple minutes left. Sharonda, do you want to pick one more question for us to answer?
Sure. I would say, how do you explain white privilege to whites?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's something I'm still learning how to do, if I'm honest. And frankly, I think some of it is that I'm still learning how to see it in my own self. I think I'm still learning how to acknowledge that in my own experience. And so to me, I really take seriously that as a white person, if I care about racial justice, it is important for me to be somebody who is constantly learning and constantly bringing someone else along. So I think of it that way, that if I'm going to be doing the work of racial justice as a white person in the United States, I need to have somebody I'm listening to and somebody I'm teaching. And that might be a friend, it might be a family member, it might be my little sibling. But how I would explain white privilege, I often start from explaining my own story and experiences as a way of entry point. It's really hard for people to argue with your own story and experience. And so I'll often start from a place of, again, humility and naming to other people. It's really hard to see, right? So if I'm talking to another white person, I'll start from a place of, it's really hard to see, and I used to not see either, and I'm still learning to see even more. As that's a way of making it seem like I'm not the expert in the room. I'm somebody who's learned a thing or two that I want to share. The second thing I would do is explain a story from my own experience of when I saw my own white privilege. So an easy example is that conversation I told you about that I had with my friend Chelsea. At the time, my oldest brother was getting in a lot of trouble with the police, a lot. And I had not one time worried that he would be mistreated in that experience. Chelsea's brother, who I know and love, had never one time been in trouble with the police. And she shared with me how scared she is all the time that he'll get pulled over for speeding or that something will happen that, and he'll be mistreated. Well, the gift of not having to worry about that is an experience of my own being privileged. And so that's a story I can draw upon and I can share as if I'm going to be talking to other white people of like, yeah, there was this moment for me when I was 23 that really opened my eyes and forced me to do some thinking. I think the other thing I'll do is if folks are starting to maybe get defensive a little bit, which can happen, I'll invite people that, hey, it's worth just thinking about. It's worth paying attention to and noticing. And it's worth doing your own kind of reflection and exploration. And I'll just challenge people to be willing to see and to listen and to consider all they might not know. Somebody asked me how my friend Chelsea might feel about my sharing my experience with her. That's a really great question. I respect her so much. And that's a conversation I always have with her is what she does and doesn't feel comfortable with me sharing from our own friendship. And she really feels comfortable with this. They asked also if she would feel comfortable sharing her experience from the other side. And I'm not sure. Uh, I'm not sure. I don't know that she's in a lot of spaces where she's sharing this. There would be a chance for her to share this story. I imagine we could tag team it, but we talked pretty candidly about what parts that she does and doesn't feel comfortable with, and I really respect that. Now, I did not ask her for permission to use those photos because I just pulled them from our social media history and she would be mad. But she's off doing birthday things and she will not ever know. um, as we are about to close, friends, I, on the end of my presentation, have a couple just quick steps you can take that I think are worth thinking about that I'd love to kind of, here's my where do we go from here? Second to last slide with GIFs. And here's just some things you can do from here as you're doing your own learning and exploring and wanting to be engaged in the work of racial justice in our time. So those are, ask your family members. Ask them about what they learned about race and racism growing up. It's really helpful. If you ask your parent or guardian, it's helpful to kind of locate yourself in a story of your family history. So how was race spoken about or not spoken about in your family history? You might even ask family members about other civil rights movements that they lived through or that their parents or their grandparents lived through. Another thing you might think about is, are you engaging with diverse voices? So you could today go look at your bookshelf and notice and look at your social media and look at kind of the TV shows you watch, the music you listen to, and pay attention to if you're engaging with diverse voices. It's really helpful for us to realize that our experiences are our own and there's experiences and perspectives from folks of different races than us that are important for us to be hearing and engaging with that will help us see our world more clearly. Get in the practice of asking when you're reading the news, when you're listening to a story, when you're reading a book, any of those things, when you're reading your history textbook, who gets to tell this story and whose voice is left out? Who gets to tell this story and whose voice is left out? Getting in the practice of asking those questions will help you be able to engage with the news and with your own history lessons from a place of more um, from understanding the perspective that might be dominating those things that we're learning. Find some people who are working towards racial equity to follow on social media and pay attention to what they post. I think that's a helpful one. You can look up the women who started the Black Lives Matter movement and follow them. You can look up some other kind of activists in your own community and follow them, and just pay attention to what they're posting and talking about in your own community. This is something that I do. I'm a big journaler, is I keep a notebook with me all the time. And often I'll take a moment to jot down all the ways that I heard or saw people say things about race or racism in any given week. I don't do this every week, but it's not an uncommon practice for me either. I'll write down every time something came up and then just take a moment to notice, where is this showing up in my life and my normal conversations? How is my mind reacting? What's my immediate reaction? And how is my body reacting? Do I tense up? Am I open to it? What might noticing teach us? This also could be a neat place for you to talk to your pastor about how your church engages with diverse perspectives, or your youth pastor. Questions you might ask are, hey, does our church have books written by diverse authors? Are we learning from diverse perspectives in our Bible studies? And you might even ask your pastor, I think you should put this to them. Do they use diverse perspectives in their sermons? When they're doing their research on scripture, are they looking up people from different cultures, experiences, and races? And then finally, know that you don't have to do this alone, that this is a communal work and journey, and you can tag a friend in to be doing this with you. You might ask a friend to be a conversation partner consistently, somebody who you're exploring with along the way. So those are some things that you might do next from here. And that might be, those are some ways that you might continue to engage and consistently pay attention to what you're learning as you go. Thank you, friends, so much for your willingness to be with me this morning, and for your honesty and asking questions. And oh, the dog gif was a hit. And just for your willingness to show up with humility and care in this space. It's been really good to be with you.
I'm just wondering, like, I've had friends in the past, or conversations in the past, where friends or people that I know have tried to like justify using the N-word if they aren't Black. What's the best way to kind of navigate that without like making, like having them shut down? Because I feel like a lot of the times when I try and look at diverse perspectives of people who try and justify using that language, they make it like seem like, well, you know, freedom of speech and it's perfectly fine. It's not a big deal. The word has changed. And it's like, no, it's still very racist for a white person to use it.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, Julia. And it sounds like you already have a good answer as well. I think a couple ways I would navigate that. One is that term has been historically used as a power move and as a way of dehumanizing people, and in order to keep it's been a tool of racism and racist practice in our history in a way that can't be understated. I would say that, you know, sometimes when I'm having that conversation with folks, people will say, but Black people can use it. And that the reclaiming of language that's been used to do you harm is something that can only be done by the people who have been harmed by the term. And so for white folks who are white, I think your answer is spot on too, Julia, that part of where I land in that conversation too is it does harm. There is no question about that. It is a harmful term. It does harm to use that language. And I think often if I'm appealing to my friends, like I don't understand the need for using language that people are communicating does consistent harm. And I think that appeal is often helpful. I don't think it actually needs to be a conversation about free speech, because sure, people can say whatever, but that is a term that does incredible harm and has been a tool to continue to perpetuate racial disparities throughout our history. And so It's not a term that I feel comfortable with. It's not a term I think is fine for white folks to use. And I would say to my friends too, like, I'm asking you to not use it when we're together, and I'll call you on it every time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a good one. Friends, thanks again. I hope you enjoy the rest of your rock experience. And I chatted my email into you. Please feel free to reach out and let me be a friend to you along the way.